Hello, everyone. What I'd like to talk about this time is the first theory, classical management perspective, and Frederick Taylor in particular. Now, the classical management perspective was all about efficiency. It had two parts. Uh, Scientific management, which was about efficiency of the individual worker and their performance, and administrative management, which was about the efficiency and performance of the overall organization. Frederick Taylor fits firmly in the first category of scientific management. Indeed, Frederick Taylor is known as the father of management. Now, he did not invent scientific management, but he was certainly the most vociferous and loudest proponent of this new way of thinking and doing, and indeed the classical management perspective did establish management as a perspective. So it is the first theory of how managers should act and what they should do. So one thing that we look to Frederick Taylor for is he's responsible for the way many managers act today, because his influence was so powerful and the principles of scientific management spread around the world over time in the late 1880s and into the early 20th century, and they became so ingrained in the popular mind that even today managers think that the best way to be a manager is to follow scientific management principles, because that seems to be what everybody agrees on is what managers are. And certainly we have come a long way since the thinking of scientific management. One of the things that Frederick Taylor identified was soldiering. Now remember, at the time, at the turn of the 20th century, and Frederick Taylor was born just before the Civil War, and he lived during the World War I to about 1915, I believe it was. He identified soldiering as one of the causes of low production. Low production or low performance was something managers were very concerned about in Europe, in the UK, in the United States, in factories in general. And soldiering was the idea that workers would act like soldiers. Well, soldiers of the day at that time in history didn't have jobs like they do today in modern militaries. Today we have MOS, military occupational specialties. In other words, everybody has a job. Quite often it's a highly technical job with specialized knowledge, and they get extensive training to do those jobs. Well, that's not the way it was back in the time, at the turn of the 20th century and so forth. Soldiers didn't have jobs. And so when the public saw soldiers at the forts or wherever they happened to be stationed, they generally saw them as standing around doing nothing. And so soldiering became equated with being lazy. And it was assumed that, as an attitude of the day, that people would soldier unless you watched them closely. So one of the things managers had to do was closely supervise all the employees and make sure that they were doing the things they were supposed to be doing. So for Frederick Taylor's part, he promoted time and motion studies. And his time and motion studies were much sought after. He spoke at Congress. He was hired by major corporations and factories all over the country to speak and indeed produce reports for them about how to better manage their workers using scientific management. So he would sit on his footstool, and he would have a clipboard and a paper and a pencil. And you can see a picture of him in the presentation I provided for you of that. How he would sit in front of someone working some fantastic machine, doing something that generally the pictures to me look highly dangerous. These machines, they're incomprehensible to me what they're really doing. Frederick Taylor would go in and sit on his stool and observe this worker, days, weeks, even months if necessary, and then he would determine what is the most efficient way to do the various jobs. He would never interview the worker. It was never considered in those days that the worker had some kind of specialized knowledge or expertise, even though they were the ones operating the machines and knew more about it than anyone. So he would write a report, and it would say, do this in this order, only this, nothing else, don't deviate. And of course, it was the manager's job to do all the thinking, according to the scientific management theory, and that the workers merely had to be hired to do that job and follow all the steps, and they needed to be closely supervised. Otherwise, they would not work. So we saw that whether it was a man or a female or even a young child, they were all subject to these new principles of scientific management. So Frederick Taylor we have to thank for this incredible thinking that is out there and widespread that what managers need to do today is closely supervise employees, look over their shoulder all the time, impress them with their authority in many ways, and tell them what they're doing wrong. So the one thing we want to remember is out of Frederick Taylor's studies and promotion of scientific management, and remember this is one half of the first theory, classical management theory, where we're focusing on the efficiency of the individual. He developed 4 steps along with other thinkers and so forth in the scientific management process. So I'll just cover those briefly to finish up. The first step is develop a science for each element of the job that's going to replace the old rule of thumb methods. Well, rule of thumb methods came from the time before the rise of factories, when the only way anything got built or made was through a craftsman. And a craftsman in a city was an influential person because they provided a necessary service, and they guarded their knowledge and took on apprentices. And really the only way something got built was hiring a craftsman to do it. The problem with this is there was no standardization of parts, and all craftsmen did it slightly different. So, for instance, you could have one craftsman in a city making a long rifle, and one in another city making the same thing. And when they were both done, they would both function and maybe look terrific, but there wouldn't be a single part on them that could be interchanged or anything. There was no commonality. And they used a rule of thumb methods to estimate things. In other words, their thumb, the distance from here to here, was used as a basic measurement. Well, obviously, different craftsmen have different sized thumbs. There's no standardization there. And so the rise of factories began to change all this when we have machines to make something the same way every time. So craftsmen used to make everything from beginning to end, every part, each person did the whole job. Well, factories started dividing up the work with division of labor and so forth, and that's what we've got today. So that's step 1. Develop that science to replace the rule of thumb for each job, the most efficient way to do it. The second step is then scientifically select the most likely employees, train them in the methods, and get them doing the work. Generally, scientifically selecting an employee in those days meant anybody with a pulse that you think could learn the job, they're in. And so you were not considered really important individually. You were somebody that could be replaced quite easily. The third step is supervise those employees very closely. Make sure they follow the prescribed methods for performing the jobs. And really it was a situation where they don't need to think. That's what the managers are there for. And then the fourth step is continue to plan the work using the scientific methodology, knowing how long it takes to make something, always trying to get workers to increase their production and to get the job done. Okay, folks, that's all I want to talk about this time. I'll meet you on the next topic.